everyone. I'm Brian Bates, and I trust Google Maps without questioning it.
West on.
I'm Linda DeYoung, and I unironically use the Kahoot music at parties.
And this is the One-to-One podcast, brought to you by the Learning Technology Center.
Hello, and welcome back to the One-to-One podcast. Brian, it's nice to see you again. How are you doing?
I am doing great. It's good to be back. It's good to be doing another episode again. Always looking forward to these. And I'm excited about today's episode as well. So I'm ready to get into it.
Yeah, for sure. So we just had Valentine's Day. And I was wondering, if you were also a person where in school you were encouraged to make like a milk box / shoe box Valentine's Day carton and bring that to school. Was it just me? Was I living in like a fever dream, or is that something everyone did?
No, you're not alone. And I will tell you that I am a little bit of a procrastinator, and I can remember saying like, hey, when Valentine's Day might fall on a weekend or like whatever on a Monday, I can remember specifically saying to my mom like the night before at the last minute, oh hey, I'm supposed to have a decorated Valentine's box tomorrow, and she was like, okay, would have been good to know sooner rather than later. But yeah, I was always last minute trying to throw together the little shoebox or milk carton Valentine's Day card. So I have good memories of it. If I asked my mom, she probably would say differently. But nope, you're not alone. That was a big deal. I remember that.
Yeah, I bet your mom loved that.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I feel like with the like milk carton boxes, right, that like there was this real frenzy about getting a certain franchise of Valentine's Day grams, right? Like whatever the hot new cartoon was or new franchise was, like that was what the kids were after. And you would see them like in the stores. There were like those little mini boxes of Valentine's Day grams, and it would have like, the pictures of the cartoon or whatever on them. I'm interested. Do you remember which one you were most excited about, or which ones you gave out when you were in school?
The two that I remember, like off the top, I'd have to like really think more about like all of them. But I think the ones that I remember immediately are, I remember Ninja Turtles. I always wanted Ninja Turtle.
Good.
Valentine's. I always thought they were great. Ninja Turtles were awesome. The original, I don't know if the original is the right word, but the movies back in the day were some of my favorites. I love the cartoons. I had all the little play stuff. So Ninja Turtles got me really excited for Valentine's Day. And then I remember as you got a little bit older, but before you were too old to like stop doing the Valentine's Day, you could get sports. So like your favorite athletes or your favorite teams or favorite sport, in general. I remember those are the two that stick out to me remembering as I remember doing the most. What about you? What were your go-tos?
So I feel like SpongeBob was very popular.
Okay.
He was a popular option. I'm not gonna lie, whenever I would get like a NASCAR or a sports related one, I would literally just be like, and like throw it away. So I was like, I don't care about this. But I loved getting the cartoons, the SpongeBob ones, the Lisa Frank ones that were like all colorful and like bubbly. And I thought those were so cool. And then of course everyone was like taping candy to them, right? And so suckers and little lozenges and stuff like that. So I remember craving the Jolly Rancher suckers specifically. Whenever we would get those little heart-shaped Jolly Rancher suckers, I was like, oh, you're my new favorite classmate. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think if you're a certain age, you can probably remember the standard red heart-shaped sucker that was like on every single one. I remember those. I also remember like the coolest people were when you got one and it was the Valentine's blow pop.
Yes.
Remember those? The pink blow pop with, and I'm sure, I taught middle school and that wasn't really a thing when I was teaching, but I can only imagine what it was like to be an elementary teacher, or if you're listening right now and you're an elementary teacher, being like, stop sending blow pops. We don't need gum in our classrooms.
Please, I thank you.
Those are things I remember right away.
Beautiful.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of other things Valentine's really like from school. I also remember when I was in middle school, the big thing was you could what was it? A crush for your crush. And you could get
Oh,
like they'd have like orange crush, all the different flavors of crush soda that you could um send out. And then there was like those the day when um they would finally give them out and you could get sodas instead of like the Valentines for your crushes, so to
oh.
speak.
We did not have that, but that makes me think of like the candy cane grams from Mean Girls, where he's like, "Four for you, Glen Coco. You go, Glen Coco."
Fall for you, Glen Coco. You go, Glen Coco.
I imagine that it's just that, but with Crush. Someone's getting very, very sugar high if they are very popular on Valentine's Day. They're just crushing like four crushes.
Yeah, that's the thing that you I'm hopefully they don't do that anymore because of that reason. But yeah, there was always like that one kid who had like a book bag full of soda on the way home.
A cooler,
And then you're sitting there going like, I'd be okay with just one. Like I'm kind of looking for just one. I'd like something to have on the way home. But yeah, that was definitely a like one of those early middle school status symbol things that I remember. So hopefully they've kind of moved away from that type of thing.
for sure.
Um, okay, if you were to do those Valentines now, so we talked about like the ones that we wanted when we were kids and the ones that we absolutely loved or didn't like. What would you give out now? Like, what would be the Valentine you'd try to find one of?
Mm.
What would it be about? Like, what would be the topic?
So this is going to be really out of pocket, but honestly, I would try to find Interview with a Vampire ones because I
Hmm.
kind of love Anne Rice and I kind of love Interview with a Vampire, and so I think that those would be very funny because it's just like kind of campy and silly, and so I think those would be hilarious, and I would love to give those out. That would make me so happy. What about you? Is there a specific franchise that you would want to give your secret admirer?
So I still think that a sports theme would be great. I also like I wouldn't be opposed to Ninja Turtles. Still at this point, because I feel like that's about where I am still. But if I was going to go some other routes, like I think that I absolutely love, and I know we've talked about this in other conversations before. I love the show on Netflix. I think you should leave, and I think it's hilarious. And
Mhm.
I feel like I already communicate with all my friends in memes from that TV show already. So I feel like the Valentines would have to be fantastic. So that's probably what I
Yes.
would go for. But yeah, I would still be fine with Ninja Turtles, giving out Ninja Turtles these days.
Yeah, I love that idea. Like the Valentine just has him in his car pulling up and he's like, "I'm doing something here. I'm doing something."
Please let me go first. I'm doing something.
I
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah.
It's a great Valentine.
It would be. It would be. Oh man. Yeah, I could go on about some other ones too, but I feel like we should probably get started with our episode.
Yeah,
Um,
probably.
yeah, like I would be interested to know what our listeners go to Valentine's would be. But since they can't talk back to us right now, I guess we'll just continue with today's episode. Today, we're all about universal design for learning. And if you're not familiar, universal design for learning is a set of guidelines that emphasizes the importance of designing learning environments to reduce barriers, engage students, and empower all learners to succeed, no matter their ability or background. So I'm excited about this topic. I'm excited to get started with this. So, Linda, if you're good with it, you want to get going?
Yeah, let's get into it. So when I think about this topic of UDL, I really think about, weirdly enough, the X-Men franchise.
Mm.
Brian, are you familiar with the X-Men?
Yeah, I watched the cartoon as a kid, and I'm not as familiar with the more recent movies. I always have friends that tell me, "Oh, you've got to watch them," and I'm like, I'm not really a superhero movie kind of person, but everyone has a different like. Oh, if you don't, I like and I know that this is not the exact same as X Men. I liked the Batman movies. Haven't seen the
Mhm.
Joker movies and things like that, but like everybody always says, "Oh, if you like Batman." Then you should watch this as your entry point. This is the one I'm like, and I never do. So my experience with X-Men is like 25, 30 years ago as a cartoon.
Well, perfect. Because maybe our listeners at home haven't heard of X-Men either. So I'm going to go ahead and give just a little bit of background on X-Men and kind of explain like why this came to mind in the first place.
Sure.
So the X-Men franchise, I really think at its core is about more than just superheroes. I think it represents a story of diversity, inclusion, embracing differences.
Hmm.
So, if you're not familiar, it was created in the 1960s by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. The X Men represent a group of quote unquote mutants, which are just individuals that were born with unique abilities, aka superpowers, who often face fear and discrimination from society because of their differences. And despite this, they go on to train at Professor Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters. And this is a place and a school where their differences are not just accepted, but they're also celebrated, they're developed, they hone their skills there. And at the school, each superhero learns in a way that suits their individual strengths, whether it's mastering telepathy, controlling the weather, or wielding superhuman strength. And so, before we get started on why this connects to UDL, Brian, do you have a favorite X Men?
So yeah, like I mentioned, I'm not deeply experienced in the X-Men universe. Isn't that what the X-Men universe or whatever? I'm going simply by what I liked as a kid. I liked Wolverine. And for nothing more than I thought it would be really cool to have those blades shoot out of your hands. And that's 100% the reason why. So like I hope you have like a deeper connection to who your favorite X-Men. So who's your favorite X-Men?
Well, first of all, Wolverine is objectively very cool.
He
Um,
is.
but mine is also not that deep. I like Nightcrawler because I think he looks really cool.
Oh, okay.
He's got like the blue fur, the cool like feet. But I mean, he's also got stuff going on, right? Like he's kind of funny. His storyline's dramatic. He's kind of a swashbuckler character, which I always love a swashbuckler. So
There you
I'm
go.
gonna have to go with Nightcrawler, uh, but mostly because he looks cool. And
I
so
think that's great. There's nothing wrong with liking a character because they look cool, and I say that as someone who likes characters who think like they look cool.
absolutely. So let's get into how this connects to UDL
Sure.
because it's like X-Men, stuff I do with my kids in the classroom. Where does
Yeah.
this connect, right?
Yeah.
So in the X-Men universe, the superheroes are obviously very ostracized for being different. Like they are, some of them like completely shunned from society. However, we as the viewer obviously know that they are cool and
Mhm.
awesome and that their differences make them strong. And so, how does this apply to students that we see in our classrooms or just the classroom experience?
Yeah, just because a student has difficulty with a certain aspect of their learning environment, whether it's they have a difficulty with the reading, whether they have a difficult time putting text down with writing, whether it's a physical limitation, things like that, it doesn't mean that they don't have awesome characteristics and awesome qualities about themselves. And you think about the times where and I know this happened when I was teaching when it was those students would get you know taken out of the room for
Mhm.
certain assignments and certain things like that. I'm like, man, that's a bummer. Like, I wish that didn't happen. And I think about later on as I was teaching, where it went from having kids pulled out to then I had a co-teacher, and they were right there, and it was awesome because you got to, instead of them leaving the room to go work with other students that had whether it was similar challenges, or maybe they just needed the extra support that to make them successful. Like, you didn't get to hear them in the classroom activities sometimes, or their voice was not included, and it's like, man, they have awesome ideas too. Just because they struggle with one little aspect of the educational environment um, doesn't mean that they don't have awesome things to add to not only the classroom instruction, but also just the environment and the learning community of the classroom as well. So, like, I totally see where you're coming from with the idea of the X-Men and our idea of UDL.
Right. And I think like oftentimes it's easy to think of differences as limitations and not
Yeah.
as strengths, right?
Yeah.
Like truly we see in our workplaces, our communities, our families, our friends, like differences are what make us unique and bring unique perspectives to the world around us and unique abilities. And so sometimes, it can be challenging to meet all the needs of our students,
Mhm.
especially when there are such diverse needs. However, we have to acknowledge too that it is ultimately like the differences that make our classroom strong, and
Yeah.
that even if a student struggles, like you said, with one aspect of the curriculum, they probably excel in so many other areas that maybe aren't even areas that we teach in schools. And so we never see them, right?
Oh, yeah.
Um, like I knew a bunch of my students who were struggling with certain aspects of the English curriculum classroom, but then they would show me like, mixes and beats that they were doing at home on like
Mhm.
GarageBand. And I'm like, you're amazing,
Yeah.
but it's just not what I'm teaching. And so I'm not seeing the amazingness that is you. It reminds me of like episode 1 of our podcast where Eric Kurt said, we're not all oil painters. And if you said, paint me a painting to demonstrate your learning, then it would be like I was not proficient in it. It would look like I didn't know what it was, but really it's just because
Yeah.
I don't know how to paint.
Yeah, and I think, it's kind of funny you selected paint, wonder why. As an artist, you know, um, just because someone is not good at painting or drawing doesn't mean they can't have artistic creativity. You think about photography and
Mhm.
how, you know, the skill of painting, yeah, the physical being able to use your hand to recreate what's in your mind or whatever, that takes a certain skill and certain talent, but that doesn't mean that you can't be artistically gifted, because
Mhm.
photography also takes, as you can look through my camera reel, and see the just disgustingly poor photography skills I have of just taking a random, like I don't ever change any settings, but like there are so many different ways to be successful
Mhm.
without having to have that one particular skill and be absolutely perfect at it. And so I think that's kind of like what we see in our classroom is like, you don't have to be an amazing student in this one area of school to be an amazingly talented person.
Yes. And just like, in the X-Men where their individual quirks and differences are like celebrated, we also see that they're nurtured through their schooling and that they do come into themselves and realize that they are important, that they have an important role to play in their own communities. And I think we want that for all of our students,
Mhm.
right? We want them to recognize that their differences are their strengths and that they should really lean into those and nurture those and build those capacities because they're going to go out and do amazing things in their community and impact so many people just because they are not exactly performing in our classroom the way that we're expecting them to by this one fixed curriculum that is such a small snapshot of who they are and how they're going to nurture those skills outside of the educational environment.
Yeah, we can't expect our students to come into our classroom as like a cookie cutter student.
Mhm.
And I think that UDL, um, provides an opportunity for every student to not just necessarily be successful, but to have a successful experience. So I what I mean like is engaged, interested, and successful. So I think that's I 100%. I love where you went with this. Like when you start talking about X Men, I'm like, where are we going here? But I love how we've framed this and how you kind of came around on this one.
Yeah. And I think with that, do you want to get into today's guest and talk a little bit more deeply about UDL and UDL concepts? How you feeling?
Absolutely, let's go. All right, today we are joined by Niel Albero, a senior implementation specialist at CAST, the organization behind the Universal Design for Learning, or UDL framework. With a background as a special education teacher, math teacher, instructional coach, he collaborates with schools and districts on implementing UDL strategies that create more inclusive classrooms and systems. His passion lies in helping educators tailor UDL to their unique settings, ensuring all learners thrive. Niel, welcome to our show today.
Just an honor to be here with you all, launching 2025 in a great way, talking about UDL, talking about accessibility. Let's rock today.
Awesome.
Awesome. So go ahead, Neil. Why don't you tell us just a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm joining you live from out here in central Massachusetts. And I was a former special education teacher in the classroom for a long time. I think 15 years, just all different varieties of special education classrooms. And it was a gift to learn about universal design for learning in that classroom. Often students that I've worked with in the special education setting are ones that are most marginalized by an inflexible curriculum. So learning about UDL, just really wanted to empower my students, to give them the strategies, the tools, the resources, the emerging technologies of the day, like the Alpha Smart back in the early 90s, if anyone thought that dinosaur of a technology would help word processing, dragging dictation software, taking the time to program that, oftentimes hours and hours, but just seeing the benefits when we got those tools up and running for our students to give them agency over their learning, to just empower them to be their best learners. I always said I changed the paradigm in my classroom from being the resource in the classroom, for being the resource that students came for, to a resourceful classroom where students made choices and had options and had tools on how they were going to achieve goals. So exciting to bring you some of those stories today. Former math teacher as well, middle school math teacher selling a product often our kids don't want to buy, instructional coach, and now with CAST for over 8 years now. Just working with schools across the country to learn about it, whether it's small groups of teachers in classrooms or if it's working on whole systems and thinking about accessibility throughout the system.
That's awesome. I'm a former middle school math teacher myself, so I definitely loved doing that for a long time. So
Yes, and I was a high school English teacher and very excited about UDL and excited to talk with you about it today. But before we get into that interview, we like to start off with a little fun. I don't want to call it an icebreaker because I know that has such a bad connotation, but just a little get to know you with our guest. How do you feel about doing that today?
Yeah, let's hit me with it. I'm ready for it. Whatever you got.
Perfect. So this game is called Speed Grade. So I'm going to give you a concept, and in typical teacher fashion, you will grade it A through F. A being something that you love or think is really important or great, C being average, and F being this concept fails, I hate it.
All right, let's do it. Let's do it.
All right. So the first one is I'm going to have you grade pineapple on pizza.
See, now you had to go right there with the hard one. I'm going to go a solid C because as an Italian American who loves to make his own pizza, like there is a time and a space where that feels really good. So it's not my go-to, but there is a time and a space when, the sweet and the salty just goes together. But I got to put either bacon or ham with that, with that pineapple.
Great answer. How about we grade the reply all option in an email chain?
As someone who often I find myself in sticky situations of communicating between, you're working with large teams. So there is, again, I'm going to go solid C. Like, what's the context? Like, there definitely is a time when reply all keeps everybody on the same page. But then you kind of have to do those follow-ups when you think somebody might not have read the reply all because not everyone takes those in. So it is a little more work because you do have to check back in. But again, solid C because C stands for context. What's the context?
There you go.
So go ahead and grade using a paper planner instead of a digital one.
Oh, I'm an A on that. So, I'm transitioning into the technology era. So I love my tech tools, but there's something about still putting paper to pencil, writing things down that activates my brain and says, "Ooh, I'm never going to forget that or memorize that." I actually funny story, working with it. You're bringing this one up. Working with a teacher, she said I helped save her marriage with UDL because she said that
Oh.
husband would forget all of the important dates that they had in their relationship. But she said, I'm going to create a Google Calendar. And if it's on the calendar and you miss it, that's when I'm going to be upset. So that multiple means, right? Creating that visual calendar really supported. So I am an A on using paper. I think it just helps me to move things around, memorize. I've got my sticky notes all over the place.
How about grading clapping when the airplane lands?
Oh, as someone who travels all over the country, monthly, 3 to 4, at least flights a month, I think when the turbulence is bad, I'm just into it, because it heightens my emotions on those really calm flights. I might fall asleep and so land while I'm asleep. But anytime, you feel like that pilot has done a great job and just kind of adjusted things in course, I give that raving round of applause.
Beautiful. And then finally, we want you to grade icebreaker activities.
I'm going to go C. Why? C for cheesy on this one. Because yes, I love to cheese things up. There's that pizza reference again. But I love to cheese things up because I think sometimes it does break the ice, especially when you're, I work with a lot of groups of teachers, a lot of schools, and we often sit with our content area, our grade levels. So those icebreakers help us get to talk to some new people. And then I hit them with the challenging content. So if I can get them talking and doing some things, I just did a puzzle activity where I took some familiar cartoons and had people creating puzzles with those cartoons to break it up. But then we did the big reflection activity. So I like those cheesy things to loosen the ice.
Well, Niel, do you feel like we've officially broken the ice?
We are cracked and ready to go. As someone who has a pond, sitting right outside his backyard, it is cold enough to skate. So, but we've broken the ice.
Perfect. Well, thanks for playing.
Yeah, and I always like, when Linda and I prepare for these, talking about cheesy and things like that. Icebreakers can be incredibly cheesy, and you can sometimes lose a room by starting off with an icebreaker that's, the one that's been done time and time and time again, and they're like, oh, here we go again. And I have to give Linda a lot of credit for always, whenever we prep for an interview, I'll be like, okay, what she got this time? Like, oh, this is really interesting. This is different. I haven't seen this one. So kudos to you, Linda, for not making these an F, but I'll give you a solid A+ on the.
Brian, high praise.
Yeah,
and some claps because you landed that plane well.
Exactly. There you go. Yeah. So we've broken the ice. Let's kind of get into our conversation for today, and I think it's important to start with sort of like a foundational understanding. So if our listeners are unfamiliar with universal design for learning, and I think now that we've said universal design for learning a few times, we're just going to go ahead and abbreviate it to the more common UDL, just to save some words there. But the universal design for learning, or UDL, could you give us kind of a brief elevator pitch about what is UDL in a nutshell, and how is it different than traditional teaching approaches or methods or planning?
Yeah, excellent. That's a great way to start. And I'm going to just give you 2 words. UDL is a framework that can take a lifetime to learn. But if you just think about these 2 words, UDL is about 2 things. It's about access and agency. So access for all learners. And it doesn't matter if the learners are the students in your classroom, if you're talking about your faculty as an administrator, if you're talking about parents and families. It's about access. My simplest definition or thought for that is, can all learners reach the learning as they walk in the door that day? And that's what we're trying to design. Classrooms where all learners can reach the learning as they walk in that day. That's access. And then agency. Agency is when students walk through the door, they have the power. They own the power over their own learning. And our practices, do they align to support that power and build skills that undergird and support their agency, so that when they leave us after schooling, they are, really confident learners. So just those 2 words, again, lifetime to know, but only a few seconds just to think about, can all learners reach the learning? Do they have access? And how am I supporting their agency in the classroom?
Awesome. That's great. That's a great elevator pitch. Easy to remember 2 words. I love it.
Yeah. And you asked me, how's it different? I think one of the things we'll get through in our process is we look at barriers in the environment, the fixed curriculum, or maybe the physical environment or the systems. We're after addressing those barriers because those learners and teachers are impacted by barriers in curriculum and systems. So when we say someone's struggling, instead of giving them all the supports to boost them up, we say, what's the barrier that's causing them to struggle? And we address that first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think often of there's this infographic of, someone like standing on a box and looking over the fence. And then it's like, if we want to make it equitable, we would give like someone like 3 boxes if they need that to look over the fence. And then UDL is really about like, how do we remove the fence? Because the fence is what's in the way.
Love it. Great analogy if you've seen that. And I love to keep those boxes on the side because maybe somebody still wants to use those boxes as a tool, right? That environment is equipped with the tools for the learners to be able to address the barriers that arise for them.
Yeah. Beautiful. So Niel, I'd love to get into a practical kind of scenario here and hear from your personal experience. What would you say is the biggest aha moment that you witnessed when a teacher or when you first grasped the power of UDL in your own classroom or in someone else's classroom?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great question. I work with teachers all over the country, administrators all over the country. And UDL is best applied to like your sticky moments, like something that's not going the way that you want it to go. And that's when the biggest aha comes because we go through a process of identifying our goals in that moment, the barriers, and switching things up. So I was working with a teacher who said, my reading time is just not where I want it to be. They had a reading program that they use. They read the stories Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And so I just kind of asked some questions about what was going on there. And I said, how do we give students more agency in this process? Because if they're not engaged, they don't have ownership. You're struggling to really keep everybody with you and eyes on text and really engaging with the text. Let's think about those words. Do they have access? Well, in some of the days they did, and some of the days they didn't. And how do we give them more agency? So we just reshifted the way that things worked in the classroom. Same materials, same tools that always existed, but just created a system where we asked this question, how do you want to read today? And so what an interesting question. If you think about all the ways that we read and all the tools that we use, we want to, use that in the classroom and get students really comfortable with becoming these lifelong readers by using these tools. So we had students choose from different tools, whether it be paper or digital text, read to options. We had them using different protocols and sitting with, choosing whether we wanted independent or group work. Like reading became so flexible in that classroom that the teacher was now available to be able to do small groups as needed, to be able to kind of give coaching as needed, or really help a student that's working on a struggling skill. So just reshifting the way that they structured that classroom. This teacher just saw the aha moments, the light bulbs. I can tell you the test scores went up. I can tell you all the great results and impacts of that. The most important being 2 students that at the beginning of the year were literally crying during these reading blocks. Left the school, left her class saying, "I'm a reader now. Like I can do this." So it was the independence. We had an anchor chart up on the wall that said, "What are the benefits of all of these different formats of reading?" And so she saw students that were partner reading who never thought about stopping to talk about the text, right? But now we said, well, when you partner read, a benefit is being able to stop and share your stories about the text. She saw greater interaction and engagement. So yeah, those are those aha moments. So pick when, as we get into this work, pick that sticky time, pick the thing that's not going the way that you want it to. And let's start there with UDL.
Let's get into the weeds a little bit more about UDL. I talked about this at the beginning when introducing you and talking about the UDL framework and the work that CAST has done to develop those and revise those. Recently, CAST revised and had guidelines 3.0. I've actually got my copy right here by me.
Copy, awesome, nice and laminated.
Yep, I've got my copy sitting
yeah,
here.
I love it.
So could you give a kind of like an overview of the changes, the updates that have been made, and how these updates are, based on what the latest research that you and your organization have been doing, the different changes, or maybe it's just the changes in technology have made things a little bit different. So, what can you tell us about the changes to the guidelines that have in this most recent iteration?
Yeah, absolutely. So the UDL guidelines went through a very thorough community-driven process over the last 3 years. We wanted to include a wider range of research and get feedback from the field, updating the research from the early 90s. So obviously there were so many shifts that we saw. Here's an activity I recommend as I tell you some of the shifts is take the old guidelines, the 2.2. So if you're someone very familiar with UDL guidelines, print out those old ones, the 2.2 guidelines, and print out the 3.0, put them side by side. And then look for those shifts, look for the changes. This is where every change that you'll see in the guidelines will come back to one of these three themes. So identifying identity as a part of variability. So what that's allowed us to say is not only is the text provided in multiple formats so that students can customize it, but what are the perspectives that are in that text? Whose view is being seen? Are there any potential barriers or threats that information might cause? So when we take in a learner's identity, it not only says, is it accessible to them, but how is it representing them? So really important piece of the work. As again, if you put those two sets of guidelines side by side, you'll notice that shifts that you say, oh, this shift is about including all identities and all people. Enhance the power of interdependence and collective learning. So feedback from the field said, we love UDL, but it often makes it feel like it's just about the individual getting better, but where's the onus on the collective learning and the collaboration? And so there were some checkpoints in there, but you'll see that interdependence and collective learning and collective reflection around the community has become a really big part of the guidelines. And then addressing systemic barriers. So what barriers lie in systems that are impacting learners? So again, take that language and see if you go through every language shift, you'll be able to attribute it to one of those things. By the way, these are things that educators in the field have been using UDL for the last 15 years, 20 years that we've been practicing under these guidelines. And this is the feedback we've gotten. So these shifts are making what we've done in the field with UDL explicit in the language.
Yeah, all very important shifts as well. I think about if you look at where, the research in education has been moving in the past few years, we see I think specifically of now we have, the Asian American standards in social studies classrooms and language art classrooms, these are so important to include in any framework, things about a student's identity and how they're positioning themselves based on that identity in the classroom. So props to CAST for revising guidelines and kind of working through some of these new shifts that we're seeing.
Absolutely.
So I'd like to get back to our teachers who are listening, because we do have a lot of teachers that tune into our podcasts, and some of them might be brand new to UDL. They might have heard of the framework or just be starting in their schools. So if they are just starting with UDL, what would you say are some simple but very effective ways to incorporate UDL principles into their lesson planning, their teaching, their classroom practices, kind of their daily going abouts in their classroom?
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for asking this question. And it's always the hardest thing. I can recommend a whole list of strategies, but strategies I think are like headlights. Like they only light up a certain amount of path and then you lose that strategy. Like we all know gallery walks work. But how many times can we use that? So I'm going to give you a process. The first thing we have to ask with UDL is, what's the goal? What is the goal of the lesson or the learning right now? And I know we've gone through in education and teachers a lot of input about using goals and making sure to write them on the board and review them like we know. But really, it's the most important piece with UDL. Give you a quick example. If I give you a text, is the goal decoding? Is the goal understanding the theme? Is the goal finding evidence, right? All of those are different goals. And the text can either enable you or provide barriers to that goal. So identify your right now goal is the most important thing. And then identify what are the potential barriers in the curriculum. So lay out your lesson and say, what could get in the way of somebody achieving that goal? So again, in that text, if the goal is to identify the theme, I might provide it for you audio or digital and paper. I might annotate that text so that you can see my thinking as you go, so you can discover theme. If the goal is decoding, well, I might not want to give you the audio, right? I want you to work through the challenging language in there, and I might want you to reflect on that. And maybe the first read is about theme or, getting fluency, and the second read is about decoding. So all of those decision-making processes happen when I say, what's the right now goal of the lesson? Then lay out all those materials, think about that lesson, and what's your sticky point? Like, where's the moment in the lesson, we call it the low point in the lesson, that students might disengage, lose access, and then that is signaling to you there's a barrier here. There's a barrier in the way that something's designed. So find that one point and add an option for your students, or increase the scaffolds that they could use. So that's the really simplest way to get UDL started. I know it's not an easy take and make strategy, but it's the thinking that really is going to create the great strategies, or allow you to go, oh, I know what I can do here. That's the strategy that I use all the time, but I'm going to use it purposefully and intentionally to take away this barrier for students.
Yeah, I think that you're as I hear you talking about that, we're talking about an approach to instruction that provides access and agency for all learners. So it's really hard to narrow down, oh, this is exactly how you should start, because you're already trying to take everyone in your classroom and make learning accessible for them. So it's probably pretty difficult to just take one thing as a instant starting point. It has to be specific to the lesson, specific to the children in your classroom, specific to, what's going on in the school itself. And so I can appreciate you saying that, like, hey, this isn't exactly like the cookie cutter template to go by. You just got to start somewhere. So I do appreciate hearing that.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And start with that process, right? Start with that process. What's my right now goal? And then what in the way the lesson's currently designed, with the materials that I have, with the methods that I'm going to go through during the lesson, where could be a sticky point or a barrier to that? And then that's where those options come. So oftentimes UDL is synonymous with, oh, just give students choice. Choices should remove barriers. So if it's just a choice for choice sake, get rid of it. It's not helping anybody. But if it's removing a barrier or making the learning more accessible, that's where that's the moment we want to put that option in.
That's right. Well, we are the Learning Technology Center, so I kind of have to go down this pathway for our next question. But what role can technology, or does technology play in supporting and enhancing UDL implementation in the classroom and at the school level?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great question, because oftentimes I'm in so many different places, and the amount of technology at students' disposal is so different. So you don't need technology specifically to apply UDL, but it obviously helps. The most important thing, I think, technology gives students back their independence. Right. So if we're using the tools, students then their agency is supported, because they can use the tools to be independent in the classroom. If it's reading, no longer do they have to be pulled to the back table to have something read to. If it's a scribe and they just speak with speech to text, they can decide how and when they use that tool. Again, when we use technology, we're thinking about what barrier is removing it for kids. So when I'm coaching around UDL, I don't just say, oh, add this tool in, add this tool in. I say, ooh, this could be a barrier, and we can use a technology option to address that barrier. Or if you don't have access to this technology, what are some other strategies you might use? But the power of technology to give students back independence, to help them personalize the learning experience, is unprecedented. I don't think ever in the history of education have we had the opportunity to truly make learning accessible for every learner. So if you're someone who's using it, keep using it. Again, align it to the barriers that you're using the technology to address. And if you're someone that's, toe dipping, get with your people, find your connections that can help you talk about the problems or what you hope to achieve, the barriers you want to get rid of for students, and then they'll help you align the technology that can do that for you.
Right. And just like, UDL is not like it's getting away from that one size fits all model. I recognize that, like, when we're like, what are strategies for teachers? What are tools that they can use? That's not a one size fits all model either. Like, each classroom is going to be different, each teacher. But if you were to identify your favorite tools that you use, technology tools to support students with UDL or teachers with UDL, or which ones you see coming up a lot when you're working with teachers, what would those ed tech tools be that you would classify maybe as your favorite ones?
Yeah, awesome. And I'm never going to give you the answer without the why, right? So one of my colleagues gave me this great quote. She said, "Date the tool, but marry the function." Right? Date the tool, like you can love the tool, but you never know if a tool goes away, but marry the function. So let me give you the functions and then I'll tell you my favorite tools for that. So the first function is accessibility, right? What tools give us the power to make text, to make language, to make writing, all of those actions that we ask students to do within the classroom, what makes it more accessible? So things like Google Read and Write, that toolbar allows students to have text read to them, allows them to do text to speech, to be able to edit and predictive language, natural readers, which can take really messy formats like PDFs and have it read to students, a great tool. And then Equatio, which is a math toolbar, which can allow students to use and write math notation digitally. So if it helps with accessibility, I'm all in. There's a couple. Can I keep going, or do you want, because I'll go right through what I look for.
Keep going.
Let's rock. All right. So then engagement, right? So what tools do we have that can increase engagement? I love things like a Trello board. A Trello board is a way that groups of students can organize information and strategy and move it around almost like a digital tool belt of sticky notes. So if we can use tools to increase engagement, that's what I'm looking for. How do we get those students and deep engagement, like collaboration over a hard project? When we can help students personalize information and the look of information, I love tools that do that. So if you haven't seen Microsoft Immersive Reader, Microsoft's Immersive Reader is just an incredible tool that will allow students to literally change the view of text. It can increase the spacing between text. It can break words into syllables. So if you have someone who's really working on that fluency with reading, check out and put some of that text into Immersive Reader. Allow them to customize that text to be able to develop their own reading voice. And then last one is I look for flexibility. Whenever I dump something into a tool, I want it to be able to, again, be able to have video, read to, digital and paper options. I want students to be able to do the same thing, to be able to have options to display in different formats. So one of our great partners that we love is Seesaw. Seesaw allows students like a digital portfolio that allows students to, we can upload information in various formats and they can do the same as well. I love things like a digital portfolio because it reminds us that reflection is such an important part of the learning process. So when students choose artifacts and they reflect on their process, that builds in that next level of learning where they learn how to learn themselves, and that gets me super excited. So look for those four things in any tool you pick. Is it increasing accessibility? Is it increasing engagement? Does it allow students to personalize the learning experience? And can you upload and can students do things flexibly within that tool?
Yeah, I love it. I appreciate you going even more in detail on that one. That's great. That's kind of where our paths intersect a little bit is with the Learning Technology Center. Our goal is to support technology integration in the classroom, and we recognize that technology is a great tool to help support UDL. But like you said, you can create some great lessons without technology, whether you're doing UDL or not. Still
Mhm.
good teaching is still good teaching. So we
Mhm.
respect the fact that you don't have to have a tech tool to make everything accessible or to break down barriers. So appreciate you kind of going into that detail. Speaking of barriers, and we've mentioned that several times throughout the episode so far. Um, we often think about, when we talk about removing barriers, we think about our students with disabilities, and there's no doubt that UDL is fantastic for supporting our learners with learning disabilities. But that's true. How can UDL benefit everybody, all learners, all the way up to our advanced learners? What would you say to someone who wants to know how UDL would support the entire classroom population?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And we have our core in supporting students with disabilities. That's where
Mhm.
CAST, the organization, got started in the
Yeah.
mid 80s, where CAST stands for the Center for Applied Special Technology. So our center was equipping students with complex support needs to be able to attain learning in the classroom. We were using those emerging technologies like the Apple IIe computer, again,
Mhm.
another dinosaur of a technology that got us started in the tech world. But how can those tools and technologies support students? And what we realized is that more and more students were coming, right? There was no way to equip every student. So we shifted and said, how do we create the flexible environment? And that's what UDL is all about. It's not about just students with disabilities, it's about variability. And that's a term that comes from the neuroscience world about all the difference that learners bring. So every learner, all 25 of our students, are different every day when they walk into the classroom. So the UDL equips us with that tool belt and that framework to say, how are all these learners different and how can I meet all of their needs? And when we design with the framework, we actually meet all learners. When you're thinking about the range of students you have in your classroom, we often throw around the term rigor, right? We don't, and UDL is never about lowering the rigor of the learning for anyone. It's about access to the high level rigor that you have in your classroom. And I attribute rigor to the level of the task. Like, what are we asking students to do? That's where rigor lies. It's kind of like depth of knowledge. That's a term in the field today. Like, what are we asking students to process, to think about? So using a graphic organizer or having a text read to you is not lowering the rigor of that task. It's actually making that rigor or that challenge accessible for all learners. So really keep your high standards, keep your high level challenges that you want. Use UDL in a way that creates the access to that for everybody.
Absolutely. And I think about like the advanced learners in my classroom, and how much, removing like accessibility issues such as a fixed curriculum and letting them go off into more, advanced concepts and giving them more choice in how they're accessing those more advanced concepts. They were like craving that kind of classroom experience because they're like, I'm bored, right? I'm sitting here, I'm waiting, and I've learned everything that you're telling me I need to learn. And so what's next?
Yeah.
And UDL gives the ability to say what's next.
Yeah, and Linda, you're really touching on that learner agency. That big part, that second part. I touched on accessibility in that section, but I really want you to focus on that agency in that section. There's actually some words at the top of the UDL guidelines. Are students purposeful? Are they reflective? Are they resourceful, authentic, strategic, and action oriented? Those are words you could actually pause over and say, wow, with all the great things that I'm doing, what do I hope my students could be more or do more of? Inevitably, when I'm in groups of teachers, they want their students to be more reflective and resourceful. Well, we've got to design environments that allow them to be that way, that get them to practice those skills. So when you're offering those multiple resources or multiple ways to demonstrate understanding, students learn to be more resourceful. Students learn to be more authentic in their ways of communication. They learn to be strategic, to choose the tools as they need them, because we have those tools at our disposal all the time. So we want them to learn that process in the safety of our classrooms and our schools.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and just, pretend we're in a scenario here, an imaginary situation where you have a magic wand and you're like Glinda. I don't know if you saw the new Wicked movie. I was obsessed, but you're like Glinda. You wave your wand and you can transform any school into a UDL utopia. What are the first 3 things that you would bippity boppity boo point your wand at and change?
All right, I love it. You keep challenging me with these questions. It's great. All right, so because we're on the LTC podcast, let's go with digital tools. That we're going to impose all the necessary digital tools. Textbooks, assignments can be created in multiple formats: audio, text, video, interactive simulations. So every activity that we have, every material can be done in multiple ways. Then we're going to equip our environment with all the assistive technologies to be able to access that material. So what are all the tools like text-to-speech, voice recognition, alternative input devices that we might have for students who need that AT? All of those resources are there. So we've got this infinitely flexible curriculum equipped with students that have infinite tools to be able to access that curriculum. And then the ability to kind of personalize the content. So that's really important. I would want the flexibility. I think sometimes the classroom walls lead to barriers that don't need to be there, right? How flexible can we be in our schools to be able to adjust to whenever students need support or whenever a student needs challenge? And that could be the same student at the beginning of the class and the end of class, or from one class or one day to the next. So flexible layouts where we can have teachers that are just interchangeably working with students. This is a vision of a school that I would have in my mind. Sensory friendly spaces, choice of learning spaces where we can be really flexible. I think sometimes the walls tell students that they're going to be in a certain class or a certain program. Yet if we're just working on the trajectory of learning for all learners, we could be so much more flexible and resourceful. And that would have to come, my last component would be that ongoing professional development. I think there is nothing stronger than a community of teachers and administrators that are learners about their practice, right? They're constantly learning about what's working and what's not in our practice. So we would have collaborative planning time and continuous feedback and support mechanisms that would help people to learn about how are we doing in this environment. And when we constantly ask that question, like, how are my practices supporting students, and we're getting that feedback and we're collaborating, I mean, that just models the type of learning we want our students to do. So I want that staff to be able to model exactly what we want our students doing in the classroom.
I want to piggyback a little bit off of that, because we've talked a few times now about, as a classroom teacher, or if you're a teacher, what should you do? What should you be thinking about? And you were kind of going down this path there at the end, talking about the ongoing professional development and what administrators can do to support like the common planning times and things like that. But let's take a shift now. If you're a school leader, and if someone's listening that's a superintendent or a principal or a curriculum director, what are some things that those district and school leaders can do to support successful implementation? Because a teacher can be all gung-ho and ready to go and realize that this is exactly what they need and exactly what their students need. But if it's one teacher in a school, that's not going to spark change. How
Mhm.
can school and district leaders really support and help foster a successful implementation of UDL in their districts or buildings?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, when districts are starting out, it's always great to do the collective learning together. So
Mhm.
have somebody in that knows UDL. Of course, CAST will be here to support you with that. But just give everyone the message of what is UDL all about. I think there's something about that collective learning. When we're all in the room and we learn about variability, when we're all in the room and we talk about accessibility, when we're all in the room and we say we are at addressing barriers, and
Mhm.
everyone is part of that collective voice, it starts to become the language. And then once you've done that, it's 3 simple things. Get every teacher to set a goal, right? Whether it's in content area goals, whether it's grade levels, it can be just even choosing one of the UDL guidelines to work on, or one thing, one area of their curriculum. If you have a goal you're working on, the fun thing about the guidelines is they all work together, right? So inevitably, if you pick your starting point, you're going to be able to touch other things through your work. But we've got to know where to start. So start with a goal. And then the second thing is put UDL thinking in a system, whether it's in a PLC, a lesson planning process, a data protocol. Oftentimes, administrators start with the barriers question. What's one barrier in this learning that's impacting students? When we input that question into a system, now the language starts to be around what's impacting students. So versus, again, that thinking that we started with of shifting, like if a student's struggling, just equipping that student, stopping and saying, what is that student telling us about barriers that are impacting them? When we put that question into a system, we become problem solvers, we become collaborators with our colleagues. It's just so powerful. And then start a team. I think there is nothing better than when working with a school who has some people that have stepped up, and they can be voluntold if they have to, but it's great when they volunteer. But if you do have that, nurture that early adopter that takes on UDL. Not only is that team going to give you some models, some artifacts, some ideas, but they're also going to have the lens of UDL to tell you what are the barriers you as the administrator should be aware of. Like, we're really struggling with this reading curriculum because it doesn't have accessibility tools. We're really struggling with some of the formative assessment procedures we're asked to go through because it doesn't have multiple options for students. That team will be able to illuminate the barriers in instruction for you as the administrator to be, okay, oh, I need to support this systemically. So there's your three starting points. Get every teacher working on a personal goal with UDL, just keeping that at the forefront, trying new things. Put it into a system. One simple question like, what are the barriers? And then get that leadership team formed so that they can help to inform you and be that kind of liaison between the classroom and the kind of the systems and policies that are going on in the school that we might want to be aware of.
Well, thank you so much for your insights on all of these questions today, Niel. We like to end our interviews every time with a challenge to our guests. And how this works is we read you like a scenario that a teacher might really be struggling with in their classroom, right? You can imagine this teacher actually, having this issue and just needing a solution. We pose this to our guest and basically task you to come up with a potential solution for this teacher. And so how do you feel about answering our challenge today?
All right. Well, we've done it so far, so let's land the plane. We got this.
Yes, and then we can clap at the end as well.
I love it. Let's do it.
So I'm going to read the challenge, then I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to think about it. And for our listeners listening in, take those 30 seconds to think through this yourself. Like, how would you answer this challenge too? And then we're going to come back on, and Niel, you're going to give your solution. All right, so here we go. A middle school science teacher is preparing a hands-on lab activity on chemical reactions. The class includes students with diverse needs. Some students have physical limitations, others are advanced learners, and others only engage when they're highly motivated. So basically like any classroom that we see today. How can this teacher design the lab activity using UDL principles to ensure it's accessible, engaging, and appropriately challenging for all students, regardless of their abilities? All right, we're going to give you 30 seconds to think about that, and we'll see you after the break. All right, Niel, we're back. What do you think?
All right. Well, this is a layup for UDL because I can go through the framework to be able to think about, what are the things I would do. So I would go right through these set of guidelines and think about, all right, what are engagement barriers in the lab? well, do all students find it relevant? Like, could we pose an interesting question and relate it to like some kind of phenomenon, this lab, to get all students engaged? Is there an interesting video or scenario that would set this up? So you can go through and think about what's the engagement barriers here, and then design some things for that. How about that collaboration? What does collaboration look like in this? Do students have roles, or do they have the choice of being independent or in groups? So let's step on those engagement barriers and minimize those and start there. Then we go over to representation and we think about, well, how's the lab information shared, right? Are the directions kind of like a multi-page document all written out? That might not be so accessible. Let's put some icons in there to represent the different steps of it that we might use, every lab. Let's put some pictures or representing the steps. Let's maybe even record it on a video if we need the steps on a video, so that the team can sit around, watch the video, pause, rewind, and adjust as needed. So how flexible are kind of the information and directions? And then last, we've got our action expression. So that's how are students interacting. I heard you said physical or mobility issues. So do we have some adaptive materials that students use to do that? The first thing I would want to do is try to keep it hands-on as much as possible. But I would look for those adaptive tools first. If I didn't have those at my disposal, could the lab be done digitally? So students could interact with the same ideas and concepts. So that's the beauty of a framework. As a coach or as a teacher, I don't have to imagine all these ideas. I can just take a walk through and say, what might be barriers to students engaging? What might be barriers to how the information is represented? What might be barriers to the interaction students are having? And I don't have to rely on just my great bag of tricks. I can go to the guidelines and say, ooh, these are all the things I should be considering.
And with that, I think we all need to clap.
Oh, yeah. The plane. Yes. Not too much turbulence, I hope.
No.
Not too much turbulence at all.
No. And I really like that activity there, because I think that really highlighted how, one of the things that you hear often is when it comes to implementing something in education, it's doing something differently, just not adding on to something. And there's nothing you said there that makes me completely change the way what I was planning on doing me, as if I'm that science teacher, me to change that lab. I'm not having to, we're not doing that lab now because I've got to do this completely different. It's just rethinking how to introduce the topic, how to provide the resources available to the students to actively participate with the lab, and then also making sure that all the materials that are needed fit whatever mode of learning those students need. So I love that idea that you can go through there and it's not a complete change of the lesson. It's not a complete overhaul. It's just rethinking a little bit of how you do things, a little bit of tweaking, and suddenly you've reduced barriers. You've made the learning more engaging and more accessible for all. And you've provided the agency. There we go. We're going to wrap up with those two words, agency and access. So thank you so much for being a part of this today. If people want to learn more about CAST, the UDL guidelines, or where they can grab their own copy and download and print, or if they wanted to reach out to you or CAST, where can we send our listeners?
Absolutely. So real simple, our website is cast.org, CAST.org. And if you want more about the UDL guidelines, you can go to udlguidelines.cast.org. That's where you can download and laminate your own UDL guidelines, or reach out to CAST and we'll send you one. But yeah, definitely get there on the guidelines. It has great descriptions of all the guidelines, what they mean, some examples. Even when I'm stuck, I go to that website and I say, okay, how can I rethink this moment or support this teacher? CAST Professional Learning is a part of the CAST organization that can support professional learning throughout schools, whether it be you want to start with a small team or you're thinking about school or district wide. So reach out to CAST Professional Learning Services. You can email us at pl@cast.org. If you like what you've seen and you want to do it again, or you want to think about this in your school, we do great consultations on just where to start, and we can start with anywhere, again, with a small team just learning about UDL and applying it to their practice, or again, whole school. My name again is Niel Albero. You can reach out at nalbero@cas.org. Feel free to reach out to me and I'll get you connected. If you heard me say something or talk about a tool or a resource today, just reach out. I can give you more information. On X, you can find me at Albero Niel.
Beautiful.
We're
And
also on LinkedIn as well. I don't know if we got that on there, but you can search me up on LinkedIn as well.
Yes, and we will put all the resources that you mentioned today, including your information, in the description on Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts.
All right. And with that, I believe the plane has officially landed. We're at our gate. And I think it's time for us to disembark. So again, thank you so much, Niel, for joining us and sharing your insights and the work that you're doing with CAST and with the UDL. This has been a fantastic episode.
Awesome. Welcome to 2025, everyone. Have a bountiful year. Good luck out there. And just remember, access an agency for all learners, whether it's whether your learners or your students, whether they're your teachers or families. Just the UDL is a framework that can help us deliver on that promise.
All right, Niel, thank you so much for sitting down with us one-to-one.
It's been a pleasure to be with you all, and I love the challenges throughout your session. You guys run this like seamlessly.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for tuning into today's episode. If you're interested in more training on UDL practices, we encourage you to join us on April 22nd for our One Size Does Not Fit All webinar by visiting our ltc.site/webinars page and registering.
And if you'd like to make this podcast your Valentine, go ahead and consider subscribing and following us wherever you are consuming your podcasts. And we will see you next time where we'll be sitting down one-to-one.